Stories of complex, ambiguous, but quite ardent interactions between a woman and a dark masculine figure are a common trope in both old and modern fiction. The classic motive of all depicting this psychic back and forth is the marriage between a woman and an animal, followed by the story of Cupid and Psyche, with the most recent revival of this being the 1700s Beauty and the Beast. From there on, the Dark Animus started to take on a much more human cloak. It could be argued that either we collectively repress the obvious, because it's undesirable, or contrarily, that the beast is getting socialized and hence more integrated. The beginning of this transformation could be marked by the Wuthering Heights, an intense roller coaster of emotion between a woman called Catherine and an obscure masculine figure, Heathcliff. Heathcliff represents the animus, the masculine psychic counterpart of every woman. However, in stories such as these, we're dealing with the Dark Animus. That is, the masculine embodiment of the desires that challenge the woman's entire worldview and whose confrontation can be deadly. The encounter with the Dark Animus is a passage through fire. Just like the sequoia's seed must be burned to germinate and grow into a tree, so does this encounter allow for development of a strong positive animus that's not just a romantic but useless ideal which appears in the third figure of this relationship, which is also always present in the story, such as Karenin or the Society, as opposed to Wronski and Anna Karenina. The Dark Animus is the needle that pricks Snow White's finger and allows for the positive animus to emerge and awaken her out of the slumber. As Geer points out in 1981, the unrealized sides of a woman's personality become fodder for the appetite of the animus. The Dark Animus represents that which she wishes to have, but to which the conscious opposition is too strong. The personality is often meek, compliant, passive, kind, and the attitude is loving towards everyone. It's non-discriminating and therefore one-sided, unaware. She's a pushover, as anything can be impressed upon her. From there arises the explosive opposing force of the subconscious in the form of a desire for this man that embodies all that she isn't. She's an angelic porcelain figure, often venerated by this dark figure. And indeed, that makes perfect sense too. He needs to be rescued from his darkness by an opposing force to complement what he's missing. But there are issues. If the Dark Animus isn't transformed, separate they cannot exist. United, they implode. Now, why is that? Often, the man representing the Dark Animus is spurned as the woman chooses an alternative, more benign option. In those cases, he withdraws into the darkness and expires, while she lives happily ever after. But such stories are all too bland, and for a reason. We sense that the problem hasn't been resolved, simply cast back into the darkness. Arguably, in this case, the woman isn't a heroine that confronts the Dark Animus and integrates him. She simply escapes and turns into a laurel, just like Ovid's Daphne, who unwittingly chooses stagnation and fear of what facing the challenge may create out of her. She cries out, "Help me, Father! In your streams have divine powers. Change me, destroy this beauty that pleases too well." She's willing to destroy herself, just please don't make her face the darkness. But even as a tree, Apollo still loved her, just like the phantom singing longingly to Christine's painting. "We kiss before we burn, you shall be treasured forever as my now precious tree," says Apollo. But she'd rather burn in fire than burn with him. The green leaves in his hair are ironically the symbol of his ultimate failure, just like the ring that Christine returns to the phantom. But there's a significant difference between these two examples. Daphne is somewhat oblivious, but Christine rejects him knowing what she's rejecting, and so the pattern changes. Unlike Daphne, who didn't even know who was chasing her, she's aware of the choice she's making, and she's aware of what she's denying. The secret wish is still there when she sings on the stairs, almost glancing back at the phantom, somewhat undecided. Pulled away by the romantic ideal, she forgets about the beastly animus. With the separation of the woman and the Dark Animus, there suddenly arises palpable tension in the air. There's a more complex pattern that comes to the surface when her true secret wish is revealed to be, in fact, to unite with a dark masculine figure. Until she manages to do just that, there is unresolved tension like an open sore that we all feel through painfully. We sense that they must unite or else there will be no peace. We think, I cannot stand this pressure, just let them get together and let it be over with, come with me. Even disaster is better than this unbearable irresolution. This apparent toxicity is full of potential, but can also kill if not handled with caution. Once the journey towards individuation has begun and progressed some, there is a strong sense of an unfinished story when it's abruptly cut. The beauty requests a rose from her father for the reason that none grow here. That means that something is missing, and this something is a vehicle towards wholeness. This is usually something that connects to the Dark Animus. In Phantom, it's the angel of music represented by the Phantom himself. Following the angel of music means venturing outside the comfort zone, as that's where what she needs to feel complete lies. The Dark Animus pushes the woman towards the realization of her feminine self through conjunctio, the marriage of the opposites. In this video, we'll look at the origin of this tension and the obsession with the Dark Animus, why the woman dies upon unison with the Dark Animus, and why the relationship tends to be triangular, or in other words, why there tends to be a third figure involved. What is the Dark Animus? The animus can take on many shapes and forms and represent different stages of the woman's development. The Dark Animus, in my opinion, represents a crucial point where the psychic seesaw will either start moving towards the opposite side, the side of development, or fall back and crash back to the ground where it had set off from. The Dark Animus is depicted as beastly, hideous, or somehow disfigured masculine figure. This is because he represents the inner masculine that the feminine tends to fear. However, he should not be equated with a primitive force or with a negative animus. In fact, in every tale, he seems to have an edge over the elegant prince and excel in something, either an ability, such as a superpower, secret talent, or character, such as determination, passion, or nobility. This attribute tends to be hidden, and this is for a reason. It's that which the feminine must bring to the surface. This is precisely because of the role he fulfills. He fills the gap and complements the woman's shortcomings through offering something more potent than an elegant prince does, the potential for transformation and growth. By bringing discomfort, he nudges the woman to seek solutions to what's been pestering her but what she's been ignoring. He's the way to realize a positive inner masculine strength, which makes the feminine core whole. Again, he tends to have incredibly positive traits, but they're hidden, as when he's the secret lover, like Christian in Moulin Rouge, or they're hidden underneath his outer personality, as in most other cases. The role of the female character is to bring them to the surface. It's just as Moore points out in 1987. The animus loves the rim of the wound and speaks forcefully through the thin tissues of our vulnerabilities and weaknesses, through our symptoms and at the borders of our knowledge and insight. My favorite example for Dark Animus is Eric, the Phantom of the Opera, as he embodies the Dark Animus to a T. A masked, shadowy figure with an incredible musical talent, Dark Angel of Music. Beastly traits, disfiguration hidden behind a mask. Inability to come out into the light of the day. He acts from behind the curtains, again also represented by his mask and linked to his disfiguration and closing the circle. He represents the night and mystery. Manipulator and kidnapper. Obsessed with the anima figure onto whom he bestows a special talent, singing in this case. It brings out this talent, which represents her soul, the passion for music they share, out of Christine. For a woman to develop her animus, she too must first descend into the darkness. The Dark Animus is so important precisely because he offers this opportunity. Matten and Jones depict his purpose perfectly in Is the Animus Obsolete? From 1987. For many of us, to become aware of the animus, tame it but not obliterate it, to have the courage to kiss the beast and make him a friend, are the essential steps in the journey toward consciousness and wholeness. This is exactly what happens in the finale of The Phantom of the Opera. Christine kisses the beast and he changes into a meek, devoted lover. But then she leaves him behind and he mysteriously vanishes back into the darkness, the unconsciousness, which makes the story unresolved. Inevitably, another confrontation between them is necessary. And this is why, contrary to some opinion, I definitely think that the sequel was a must. Just like the beauty who ventured back into her father's house must return to the palace lest the beast die, every heroine, if she is to attain completeness, must return to the Dark Animus. In Phantom of the Opera, Christine rejects Eric's ring, which marks the incompleteness of the story. In some versions of The Beauty and the Beast, the beauty puts a ring on her finger to reunite with the beast. This is where the sequel steps in, as it, in fact, attempts to lead Christine towards the complete individuation. We learn that she did look for the phantom beneath the moonless sky, she descended into the dark, and she would have followed anywhere he led, but it was him who ran away this time.
Yes, I loved you!
The Dark Animus himself is a fickle being. He'll stay in the dark with you, but once you shine the light into his face, such as in Psyche and Cupid, or Beauty and the Beast, the original story, it's where the real challenge begins. This is where in both old and modern stories, the heroine must accomplish a specific task that leads to the integration of the Dark Animus and individuation. The romanticization of the Dark Animus there is therefore helpful. Eric sets Christine's soul ablaze because he wakes it up from its slumber, the monotonous life without singing, with soul. He makes her soul sing again. The symbolism and language used there beautifully depict the true importance of the Dark Animus. But yet again, Christine is passive and reluctant, despite the fact that she knows this is what she truly wants and should do, and this is why the story ends the way it does. When the call of individuation isn't listened to, when we pursue a career in law despite having great passion for art, for example, the consequences tend to be dire. Why tension happens? As I mentioned in the beginning, we're dealing with a strong opposition to the traits found in the other on both sides. The woman is ashamed of her dark desires due to her outward presentation. She likes being liked by others, and the traits liked by others are the ones that make her angelical. On the inside, she's plagued by wild fantasies and longs for someone to steal her away in the middle of the night. In a similar fashion, the Dark Animus is a brute with a very fragile core. He's deeply ashamed of himself and yearns for someone pure to elevate him from his debasement. This is a problem. Instead of being proactive in change, meaning integrating the traits he so admires into his action, he acts on his negative traits only, just like the feminine figure on her positive traits. The tension arises from stagnation. The yearning is the potential for character development, which is the forward force, but there's also a hindrance in form of the inability to let go of the status quo, which is the backward force. Both push against each other, creating unbearable tension, and nothing really happens on the individual level. This is why the Dark Animus and the feminine figure must confront each other to resolve the tension. Where does the obsession with the Dark Animus come from? Again, in these stories, on a closer look, the obsession is mutual, not one-sided. We're not talking about stalkers that pursue a prey that doesn't even know they exist, or abusers. We're talking about stories of complex mutual psychic ties. People tend to simplify this by stamping labels on them, such as toxic, but that's like calling someone racist. Well, it doesn't tell us much about why, or if it's our own projection rather than reality in the first place. Sure, there are strong emotions bordering on violence, or well, there is violence. Heathcliff. And there is delusion, such as in Bella's idealization of Edward. But this layer can be peeled off to reveal a psychic conflict on both sides that yearns to be resolved, which gives rise to this mutual obsession. It's been shown time and again that a woman's fantasy is rife with Dark Animus motives, whether it be fantasizing about vampires or elopement with a stranger. Men often complain about how women tend to choose the bad guy. This paradoxical phenomenon has been addressed as foolishness or a form of sadomasochism, but I think it's in reality natural. The majority of women are drawn towards men who aren't afraid to act because it means they can provide security. That we seek it in the more extreme form is an amalgamation of different factors. In our society, the weakening of men is one. In times of old, when warring was rife, one could be the association between ruthlessness and increased survival. In many of these stories, the woman dies upon the unison with the Dark Animus. Why does this happen? So in the case of passionate, obsessive love of a mortal woman for a dark figure, such as vampire, werewolf, or even just a bad boy, tend to follow a somewhat macabre pattern. The woman dies or is completely ruined. After uniting with Edward, Bella must physically die. When Christine and Eric can finally be together, Christine is shot to death. Catherine dies in childbirth upon uniting with Heathcliff. Karenina can finally live with Vronsky, but she throws herself in front of a train. When Christian and Satine sing the lover's secret song in front of everyone, Satine is killed by consumption. And so on and so on. Why does the woman die when she can finally join with a secret animus? Normally, it's because she couldn't reconcile the opposites, or in other words, integrate the Dark Animus fully. There's one common element in these stories, and that's the fact that the woman succumbs to her desires instead of assertively integrating them. She joins the dark side, so to speak, but what she ought to do is to rein it in consciously. We'll now look at a passage from Thomas Harris's Hannibal, which depicts a number of somewhat twisted interactions between Clarice Starling and Hannibal Lecter. When Clarice encounters Hannibal for the final time, she almost dies, but then she doesn't. He tries to manipulate her, but her strong personality resists. She escapes with a man, but remaining herself. Hence the shadow is integrated and they become equals. Looking at that case, it's understandable why women in other stories die. Starling is altered by this encounter so much that she's unable to return to the society. I love the controversial ending of this book because it captures the severity of the inner conflict and the dangers of either escaping from or confronting the Dark Animus. Reading the previous books, one can clearly see that Clarice had in her traits what Hannibal eventually brought out since the beginning. Normally, the female figure dies because she just can't reconcile the opposite on her journey towards individuation. Karenina can't live apart from the society, or rather she can't live her true self in the society. Unable to bridge the two together, Christine leaves with Raoul while looking back at the Phantom, and in the sequel she doesn't send Raoul to hell when she has the chance to, and that mistake backfires. And Catherine is torn between two extremes so much that she dies. Tatine should have gone with Christian but didn't want to break his heart as she knew she was at the death's door. This inability to be selfish or decisive for once where it matters is what kills these women. This is in direct contrast with what the Dark Animus does. He's driven by that which unites him with his anima, and that's why he lives. He has a fire in his heart, a libidinal force. Whether it be passion, love, hatred, or obsession, he follows it wherever it leads. Clearly, there is more development necessary for any mention of a healthy personality, but I'm pointing out the reason why he lives, when he lives, in the story. In contrast, the female figure remains passive and torments herself with all but what truly matters, and so she dies. An interesting case is that of Cersei and Jaime Lannisters. Clearly, Jaime is Cersei's Dark Animus. He's even the physical embodiment of these dark desires, given that he's her twin brother, but Cersei doesn't care about his love. Where Jaime sacrificed even his pride for her, she merely used him as a narcissistic extension of herself. I'm almost certain the same pattern will eventually play out in their story too, and Cersei's emotional frigidity and an obsession with all the material, but never with what truly matters, will be her downfall. To drive my point home, when the situation is reversed, it's the Dark Animus who dies. Edward was going to kill himself upon his separation from Bella. Vronsky attempted a suicide when separated from Karenina. Dracula died when Mina left with Jonathan, and Eric succumbed to his darkness when Christine left with Raoul, just like Heathcliff did. For him, it means that the feeling, the feminine side, the anima, is destroyed, and for the man, the anima is his soul, and the body without the soul cannot live. For the woman, the animus is her guiding light. She can live without it, but it's like living in the darkness. She lives until she stumbles on a rock she can't see in the dark and falls to her death. Now, the whole situation is so complicated because achieving compatibility between light anima and the dark animus is an enormous task. Not only does the feminine have to be able to descend into the darkness, it must also be able to take the reins instead of succumbing to it, and the dark animus must be willing to listen to her and say goodbye to his lair. The goal is not to tame the animus, but rather to understand him, and then he submits himself to her, his soul. All this is out of character for each. The feminine is usually the passive, receiving element, whereas the masculine is the leading element, the one in charge. To coexist, each must be able to sacrifice, adapt to change, and incorporate each other's outlook into one's own. When successful, true individuation can take place, and indeed, they find their true happiness in each other in contrast to the self-annihilation or the unbearable tension that never leaves their mind when they choose to stay with the easier choice, which represents the third element in this relationship. For her, her conscious desire, or for him, his dark traits. But in fact, by doing the unseemingly unnatural, each fulfill their role. The woman submits when she enters the darkness, and the man brings the light when he lets the woman guide him. Just like he develops his own compassion through hers, she matures when brought out of her naivete and confronted with the dark aspects of the world. One-sidedness develops into wholeness. Why there tends to be a third man, a benign but unfulfilling choice. Now, in all these stories, there's a third element, the benign but unfulfilling choice. For the woman, it's represented by a masculine figure or a masculine symbol, such as the society or some other ruling organization, underneath which lie either a materialistic wish or a moral obligation. For example, in the Clarice, Starling and Hannibal Lecter relationship, the police force is this third element for Clarice, as it represents the values bestowed upon her by her late father. This third element has the same character in every single case, with no exception. And in Wuthering Heights is the fulfillment of Catherine's wish to be materially secured and have a position in the society. The same is true for Karenine, who later morphs into the society as a whole for Karenina. Despite the repulsion and resentment towards them, she cannot bear it without them. Twilight's Jacob is the less toxic guy, and Bella feels morally obligated to reciprocate his love. For the Dark Animus, there is of course a third dark feminine element that represents the return into the womb, the comfort of what he knows best, but what stifles his progress the most. It's a plunge into the darkness, reveling in his dark traits psychologically, such as in scamming, or physically, such as in excessive whoring or drinking. The triadic composition is common in stories because triads underlie the conflict behind our individuation. In the case of the feminine individuation, her goal is to reconcile the opposite and achieve stable singularity.